Coming up, now that the ringmaster, Boris Johnson, is gone, in the Tory circus, the lions are eating the clowns. Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are being chewed up and soon spat out as they have no mandate from the parliamentary Tory party, let alone the electorate at large. They're merely useful idiots, funded and instructed by libertarian organisations with opaque funding, generally headquartered in Tufton Street, conveniently situated near the Houses of Parliament. These are the same dark money lobby groups that brought you Brexit, the ERG, Boris Johnson, and now this Truss Kwarteng tragi-comedy. In this video, I'll be taking a closer look at these Tufton Street outfits, who they are and how their political aspirations mean turning the UK into a free market utopia with minimal public services. Stay tuned. If you enjoy watching my videos, please give this one a like and spread the word by sharing a link on your favoured social media platforms. If you subscribe, you can also hit the bell icon to be notified of each new video I release. As a former Lib Dem, Remainer, and also a former bit on the side for the obnoxious Tory MP Mark Field, who has a penchant for roughing up female climate protesters, Liz Truss is not exactly faithful to her commitments. But she's very faithful to her puppet masters, the Shady libertarian groups based in and around Tufton Street, London SW1. It is they who have overseen her tax cuts for the richest, where even after the U-turn on scrapping the top 45p tax rate, it's still the richest in society who will benefit the most from the 1p cut in basic rate tax, along with the freezing of the tax thresholds and allowances. And of course, business owners who have swerved an increase in corporation tax from 19 to 25%, which would still have meant that the UK had the lowest corporation tax rate in the G7. This is precisely what those Tufton Street so-called think tanks had planned, along with their ally Truss, for many years. But before I go any further, let me just set out what I mean by Tufton Street. Sam Bright at Byline Times defined the expression as referring to the primary command centre for libertarian lobbying groups, a free market ideological workshop cloistered quietly in the heart of power. Many of these lobby groups are headquartered at 55 Tufton Street or next door at number 57, and they all have a lot in common. Secret funding from unknown financial backers, plus lobbying for government policies of low taxes, cuts to public spending, anti-immigration measures, climate change scepticism, an anti-EU stance, strict controls on trade unions, and reduced employment rights. A lot of these are centred around an investment in Brexit, both politically and financially. And according to former Vote Leave employee Shamir Sani, they hold bi-weekly meetings to agree on a single set of right-wing talking points, and with the objective of securing more exposure to the public. You can judge yourself how successful they are with this latter aim by looking at the number of times their spokespeople appear on flagship political programming on the BBC, Sky, ITV, and the new weird right-wing news stations popping up all over the place. You'll recognise some of the names. For example, there's Civitas, closely linked to Michael Gove, which parades itself in the media as a non-partisan right-of-centre think tank, but in reality is a lobby group campaigning against green regulations, legislation designed to reduce climate change, and to a greater reliance on renewable energy. I don't think it's a great conspiratorial leap to imagine that they're funded by the fossil fuel industry, but they certainly aren't working in the interests of the great British public, that's for sure. Then there's the European Foundation, describing itself as a Eurosceptic think tank chaired by Conservative MP Bill Cash, founder of the Maastricht referendum campaign right back in the 90s, one of that group that Prime Minister John Major described as the bastards. When not attacking the European Union, this group campaigns to promote scepticism about man-made climate change. They share 45 Tufton Street with a similar organisation, the Global Warming Foundation, whose founder is the ex-Chancellor and Brexitist now living in France, Nigel Lawson. Their stated aims are to challenge what they characterise as extremely damaging and harmful government policies designed to mitigate anthropogenic global warming, man-made climate change. They've breached Charity Commission rules on impartiality in the past. Then there's Global Vision, which seems to still be fighting for an imaginary pure idealist Brexit, with ties to a couple of dozen Conservative members of both Houses of Parliament. Then there's Migration Watch, which is fixated on lowering immigration into the UK. The New Culture Forum, another unashamedly hard right-wing so-called think tank, whose mission is described as challenging the cultural orthodoxies dominant in the media, academia, education, and British culture in its widest sense. Then there's the ubiquitous Taxpayers Alliance, which, despite the name, is about as far away from an alliance of taxpayers as you can get, with 55,000 members, each of whom is probably a billionaire, although we just don't know as they won't tell us. The Taxpayers Alliance was given the lowest possible grade for financial transparency by Who Funds You, a British project that rates and promotes transparency of funding sources of think tanks. All we know is they're a very right-wing pressure group looking after the interests of the very wealthiest in society. A little bit then like their neighbours in Tufton Street, the Centre for Policy Studies, the CPS, a pressure group based on the founding principles of free markets, small state, low tax, national independence, self-determination and responsibility. The group has historical links to the Conservative Party and was co-founded by Margaret Thatcher. The organisation Transparify, who investigate the funding of these shady lobby groups, rated them as highly opaque, one of a handful of think tanks that refuse to reveal even the identities of their donors. So all of these groups I've mentioned coordinate their activities through fortnightly meetings. And with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng in power, at least for now, they've been given the opportunity to use Britain as their very own libertarian laboratory, as Liz Truss shares many of their small state, deregulated market beliefs. Her appointments to cabinet have all been from the ranks of this same libertarian small state sect. A recent New York Times article by Sam Bright claims that 5 of Liz Truss's closest advisers are all members of one or other Tufton Street think tank, with 9 others that attend those bi-weekly Tufton Street meetings infiltrating other major government departments. Oh, and I've not yet even mentioned the Institute of Economic Affairs, who seem to be just about on every political TV programme right now. Their head, Mark Littlewood, is another Truss advisor, and he says that Truss has spoken at the IEA's events more than any other politician over the past 12 years, which tells you everything you need to know. The IEA described themselves as the UK's original free market think tank, expounding the role of the markets in solving economic and social problems. Again, their funding is a tightly guarded secret, but is alleged to be those same old fossil fuel companies plus big tobacco and extremist American libertarian groups. They themselves only say that half of their funding is from private individuals, entrepreneurs and small family businesses, with the rest coming mainly from foundations, trusts and large businesses. That's all we know. But it seems to get them on everything from Newsnight to Question Time. During a recent episode of which, their representative, Emily Carver, answered SNP MP Alan Smith's question about their funding with the retort, "It's secret." Quite why such an organisation should be afforded a public platform on Question Time or any other state-funded media, I'm dumbfounded. Not only does the IEA not declare its funders, but it's also been the centre of controversy when it was accused of offering American donors access to UK government ministers. Amazing what money can buy in UK politics. The Tory party annual conference featured stalls representing many of these think tanks, and there's no doubt that their influence is reflected ever more strongly in the Truss incarnation of this putrid government. In fact, to all intents and purposes, with the appointment of Truss as Prime Minister, the Tufton Street Mafia have got everything they want. Their own useful idiot at the head of government. And unfortunately for the British public, these dark money lobby groups work on behalf of corporations and billionaires who are for the most part domiciled overseas and for whom Britain's interests are of no real consequence whatsoever. You saw one face of this with Kwasi Kwarteng partying with his laughing hedge fund buddies as they made more millions from shorting the pound during his recent fiscal event, come mini-budget, come budget, as the poorest amongst us were pushed even further into destitution. These Tories like to portray themselves as the patriotic party, but they actively work against this country's interests, the very opposite of patriots. George Monbiot talks about the current leadership all being members of an extreme neoliberal cult originating back in the 1930s, but who have only recently become more than just fringe weirdos as they started receiving serious financial backing from some of the richest oligarchs on earth and political backing from the oligarch-owned media. Neoliberalism had its first British triumph with Margaret Thatcher coming into power, and it has been pretty much the dominant force in British politics ever since, even if slightly neutered under Tony Blair. In post-Brexit Britain, and now with the arrival of Truss and Kwasi, it's reached its most extreme form, where money takes precedence over democracy, and the people with the money are effectively the people now in charge. I mean, how many people voted for this particular Prime Minister or her policies? Well, the answer is only 113 out of 357 Tory MPs in the last round of voting. That's less than a third. And only 81,000 Tory members. That's 0.3% of the total British electorate. In other words, 99.7% of us didn't vote for Liz Truss. It's not democracy that put her there, it's money, with the largest donation to her campaign being £100,000 of fossil fuel money from the wife of a former BP executive, and another 50 grand from Graham Edwards, a board member of Tufton Street's Centre for Policy Studies. Oh, and she was also given £5,000 by Lord Vincent, a Tory peer who contributed to the Tufton Street Global Warming Policy Foundation, the climate science denying think tank mentioned earlier. And she also, by the way, took £20,000 from John Moynihan, a former prominent member of the Vote Leave campaign and an associate of that other Tufton Street outfit, the Institute of Economic Affairs, which both Truss and Kwarteng have been indoctrinated by ever since they entered politics as malleable rookie politicians. The Institute of Economic Affairs and the other Tufton Street outfits outlined in this video are no longer lobbying government, they are the government. They like to position themselves as think tanks, but let me make this clear. These are not honest intellectuals sitting around with blank pieces of paper thinking up ways to improve society and the economy. Far from it. These, instead, are dogmatic, dyed-in-the-wool libertarians whose only contribution to thinking is in thinking how best to get their extreme beliefs accepted as rational and normal by the mainstream media and by the government. The reality is that they are lobby groups acting on behalf of the oligarchs and the corporations who give them money. And I, for one, am fed up with seeing them represented on the BBC, Sky, ITV and other broadcasters without being challenged on their funding or on their legitimacy to even be on these platforms in the first place. These are the people ultimately responsible for the massive economic crisis caused by the Truss-Kwarteng leadership. Their goal is to create the conditions and excuses for a situation where Truss can turn around and say, we can't now afford the NHS. We can't afford to stick with our pledge to raise benefits in line with inflation. We have to squeeze the public sector harder, sell off those parks, start fracking, privatise what's left of the public sector, start charging for GP appointments. The next 2 years are the most politically dangerous of my lifetime because the principal role of any government, in my view, is to provide a safety net for all of us when we're at our most vulnerable. It's also there to provide a publicly owned infrastructure that allows for economic growth and the prosperity and well-being of the population. Take that away, And I don't think that in these febrile times we're that far away from civic unrest. And I'm not saying that as a call to take to the streets. I'm just trying my best to tell the truth on my little inconsequential YouTube channel. But that is the very reason I set up this channel, because after all this talk of shadily funded lobby groups that have taken over our government, I believe it's the mainstream media as much as anybody who is to blame for this state of affairs. Their obsession with equivalence, allowing these bonkers neoliberal extremists to have an unchallenged platform to get their crazy ideas accepted as a new orthodoxy by the public and more particularly by the government. An orthodoxy that has tanked the economy and has caused financial hardship to millions, as neoliberal economics 101 dogma comes face to face with reality.